Hello, welcome back. Today I want to finish this project off with you guys. Last time we set up the lights, we set up the rocks, the ground, and the environment for this scene. There's an HDRI world light in the scene, and now I just want to add in some additional lights and cameras to finish off this render. So first thing I'm going to do is drop into the smooth shaded mode and start to add in some more lights. So Shift and A, I'm going to search for a area light. I'm going to press G on the keyboard and the Z to move this on the Z axis and just bring it up above our character. And I'm going to set this to about 15 watts. You can use the size on the property editor here to change the scale of this area light. So this is quite small and this is much bigger. We can see the effect on this in a second. The next thing I want to do is add a spotlight, and again I'm going to press G to grab this and just move it around to the side of our character, maybe about here, so we can shine a light across this direction. Because if we look now at this in render view, we have a nice shadow coming here through from the world light, but we want to add in some extra light coming across this way to highlight the face. So we're going to do that with this spotlight. We could press R and like start to rotate this guy around and try to point it like directly at my character. But what's easier to do is use a constraint and an empty. So I'm going to press Shift and A, and I'm going to search for an empty, and I'm going to use an empty sphere. Okay, press G and then Z to move it up towards the face. So like this is in this point right here is in the middle of the face. Press S to scale this down and just make it a bit smaller, easier to manage. And then G and X to move it across a little bit. So this we can use now as a point that we want to shine our light at. And to connect these two things, select your spotlight here. Go to the object constraints on the side panel here, which is this second blue icon, and add an object constraint and use the track 2. And under the target for this, we're going to add this empty, and this is called empty 001. So I'm going to do track 2 and search for empty 001. Now, if I move this light, it will track to my empty if we can connect it. Right. So if I grab this light now, no matter where I move, it's always going to shine or point itself at this empty. And the same goes if I move this empty, the light is going to shine wherever this empty is. So this is a lot easier for us to control now. I'm going to change this spread size because you see the spot size of this is really, really large. So choose your light, come to the light settings in the bottom, choose the green light icon, and bring down the spot size like this to form like a sharper light shining on our character's face. I'll set this to maybe 200, and let's take a look at this in render view. So now that I've got these 3 items, I can put these into a collection of their own and call this lights. So I'm going to select these 3 objects, the area light, the spotlight, and the empty, and press M on the keyboard to move them to a new collection. New collection, and call this lights. Okay. And now I've got all these objects in here, and if I want to turn this off, I can control all the lights through this one switch here. So this is with the lights on. You see we have some highlights kind of bouncing in the background, and we have a much nicer light kind of shining on the face here. If I turn this off, everything gets a lot darker. So we just add these 2 lights in to brighten up the scene a bit, especially for a close-up shot around this area here. Okay. Next, now that this lighting is fixed a bit, we're going to add the cameras. So I'm going to press Shift and A and search for a camera, and just drop a camera in the scene. So again, you could grab and move this camera around, but a nice way to set up an active camera. We know if it's going to be our active camera because we can click on this camera right here. So now this box, this camera icon has a grey box around it, so I know that this is my active one. And if I press toggle camera view here on the side of my navigation, I'm going to look directly through this camera, and right now it's just pointing at the ground. Again, if I press this white camera icon here, it's going to jump back out of this camera view. What we want to do is kind of set up the shot just in a viewport like this. So let's say this is how we want the camera to look. And then press Control and Alt on the keyboard and then the 0 on the number pad. And that will jump into the camera. So this has now moved our camera into this position. So if I jump in and out of camera view now, I've kind of set up the angle of my camera. So that's Control, Alt, and the 0 on the number pad. And now, if I press N on the keyboard, I can bring out my side menu and I can use this lock object, lock camera to view. So if I activate this box here, I can now zoom in with this camera, I can rotate my camera, and I'm staying in my camera view. If I turn this off, I'm going to jump out of camera view and I'm not viewing things through the camera anymore. So this is a nice way to really line up our shot as we want it. I'm just going to zoom in like this. And this camera's focal length is set to 50. So if I select the camera here, I look at focal length, this is set to 50. So we're getting this kind of a bit of depth distortion in a way. So I'm going to turn this to 100. And that will zoom us in a bit. So if I zoom, it changes the value of this focal length here. My camera's going to zoom in and out. But it's not the way that we want to zoom. We want to set a good focal length. So I'm going to do 100 here. And then just zoom back out of my camera like this. Okay? Line up the shot like this. And then we're going to add an empty back into this scene. But now that we've got a camera nice and set up, I want to split my view so that I can see on one side of the screen my camera and then on the other side of the screen my viewport. So right click this join on the right side here. Choose vertical split and split the screen in half like this. And now I've got my camera view on this side and on this side. Again, N will, on the keyboard, will turn this menu on and off. I can jump out of camera view here and start to take a look. So let's add another empty. So press Shift and A and look for empty. Add a sphere, scale this down, press G and then Z to move it up, and then press S again. And this is going to become our focal point. So I could rename this empty focus, for example. I'm going to set this around the front of the face, just so that we can use this as a focal point for now. And the focal point will be this origin point right in the middle of the empty right here. And then with this camera selected, I'm just going to go into view on this side. I'm going to turn off camera to view, and I'm just going to zoom in on my frame like this. And then I'm going to turn back on camera to view, so if I want to change my angle, I can change. What you'll see is if you look in the 3D space as well, as I move this around here, you can see my camera moving in 3D space. So this is how I'm, lighting up my camera. I want to set it so that this seam in the background is kind of directly behind my character, and that the puddle is kind of central in the scene. Okay. So now we have the focus empty, we can set the depth of field. So let's turn on render view and look at how our scene is starting to look. Right. If you want to look at this without having all of the, these visible icons, we can turn off the overlays on the screen. And you can do that by clicking this show overlays icon here. It's these two circles like overlapped. Turn that off and now we just see the render. Now we have no focal depth. The foreground, the background, and anything in the middle is all the same focus. If I choose this camera, come down to depth of field and check this box here, we're going to go into a bit of a blur because this is set by distance now. So this is focusing at 10 meters from the camera. And we want it to focus directly on this object here. So again, go under focus object, choose empty focus, or the empty that you've used to, that you've created for this. And now this part of our images will be in focus, like the water and the face, and then the background and the foreground will start to blur away. We can control this depth by using the f-stop, and a smaller number will be a larger amount of blur, and a higher number will be less blur. So if I set this to 4.2, I'll have a bit less blur in the scene. This will just make the camera feel a bit more natural. And what we can do now that we've got this set up is if I choose this camera here, but take these objects first of all, my camera and my empty focus, and I press M and put them in a new collection called camera just to keep things tidy. I can then choose this camera, press Shift and D to duplicate it, and I can then look through, set this as my active camera. So again, this one's got the gray outline around it, this one doesn't, this one's active, this one's inactive. So if I click this camera here, this now becomes my active camera. So if I move this, I'm going to be looking through this secondary camera. What we can do as well is add a constraint to this camera. So it will always look in the same way. So we can set a track to, target, we can set this to empty 1, for example, and now it will track to empty 1. You might want to add another empty in for this, so just quickly press Shift and A. No. Shift and A, look for an empty, add a sphere, make this smaller, and call this one camera tracking. So you see how we're using these empties to track our cameras, our focus, and our lights right where we need them. So I'll make this one a bit smaller, set it kind of in the middle of our avatar. Select this camera and choose empty camera focus, we called it. Camera tracking. There we go. So now if I move this guy, my camera is going to follow wherever this this empty gets placed. So this is how we can connect all these things to work together. I might want to set it here. Again, I can look at this in the display port, the viewport as well, and line up a bit of a shot that is closer to our character. Okay. And again, maybe we move the empty a bit to set up the, let's go like this. So now, because I duplicated this camera, I should have the same depth of field settings, and they are still on the same, focusing on the same empty, and we have a nice close-up shot and a nice wide shot. Spend some time working on the types of shots that you want to set up, but for now I'm just going to render out these two and just take a look at some of the settings we need to be aware of. So if you click on your GPU setting, your render settings on the top, this one that looks like a camera, make sure when rendering with cycles, our device is set to GPU, and then we can look at our render settings. So for our render, I want to turn off denoise for now. I want to set the samples to 1024, so it'll be 1,000 samples rather than 4,000 that it was set to before. And we can leave this noise threshold at 0.01. If I make this number bigger, it's going to render faster, it will have more noise, and if I make this number smaller, it will render slower and it will have less noise. So for now, this is what we are going to set this to. Just check under your light paths here that you have some additional light paths for your transparency to make sure that the hair is working correctly. And then we can go ahead and set up a test render. So I'm going to turn this render view off and just hit F12 on the keyboard to create a render. Okay, so this is rendered out. I just want to change the depth of field so it's a bit stronger again, so that some more of this blurs out, and then we can take this into Photoshop and start to look at doing some color correction. So I'm just going to close this, come back into my camera, come back down to my depth of field settings and just put this back to 2.8, and I'll do the same for the close-up, 2.8. Let's maybe move this camera angle a little bit. This, and then let's render this one more time. For your image resolution, use your output settings here. So this this one that looks like a printer is set to 1024 by 1024, so this is a 1K render at this point, which is fine for what we want to do. So I'm just going to hit F12 again and see how this renders out. Okay, this is rendered and it's looking better with the depth of field kind of increased as I had it from the first time. So I'm going to save this image. I'm going to go to Image, Save As, make a new folder called Renders. And then in here, save this image. Then we'll go to our next camera and do the same. Let's hit F12 and see how this looks. I think for this one, as I see it rendering, I want to change the angle of this camera, so I'm just going to cancel this. I'm going to move this camera this way, so we're shining, we're looking the opposite direction. Just use this empty to move the camera. Okay, let's try now. I advise you take some time to set up your cameras, lights, and materials and everything to get really the best look you can. This is looking better. Okay, so this one's rendered out as well. I'm just going to save this in the same place. And then what we could do is actually have a quick look at the compositing space. So if we come from layout into compositing in the top, choose compositing up here, turn on use nodes, and we will see our render in our render layers here. This is our composite, this is our render, and in the same way that we work with the texturing, we can add nodes and processes between these to edit this image. So the first thing I will do is press Shift and A to add a split viewer. Okay, and then what we're going to do is plug in some processes. So let's say we want to put in an RGB curves. Let's start with that. So I want my image to feed into my RGB curves. I want the output of this to be my composite, so I'm going to connect this to the composite. For the split viewer, I want to see how this effect is changing the image. So I'm going to put into one view my edited image and into the other view my unedited image. So the left side will be unedited and the right side will be edited. To zoom on this, use V to zoom out on the keyboard, the V key, and then Alt and V to zoom back in. So V, Alt V. Okay. Now, if I change this curve a little bit, move this bit up and this bit down, you'll see this side of the image is being adjusted. I can move this point of change in the image using this slider, or I can change the direction using this split here. So let's keep this in the composite, split up here. And now I've pushed a little bit this curve to get a bit more contrast in this image, but it looks a bit red. It looks a bit orange and red in the face. So I'm going to press red to look at the red channel and just take out some of this red. So move this down. This would add red in, so it becomes pinker, and this would take out red. This would reduce it. So take a little red out. And then for now it's looking slightly yellow. So for yellow, to fix this, we're going to go to blue, choose the blue channel, and push a bit of blue into the image. So you're going to push over this channel. And this can start to correct our coloration in the skin, for example. So I can turn this RGB strength curves up and down using this slider here. So I'm going to keep this at full strength, and I'm going to turn it to film-like. This has given me a much nicer skin tone now. I can look at how the green channel affects this as well, but I don't think I need to make much of an adjustment to the green. And then we can look at adding other processes. So let's search for an exposure and add the exposure in here. I could increase the exposure, I could decrease this, maybe bring it down a little bit, and then add in search for a gamma. And then this might be able to affect a little the gamma in the image as well. So let's say we're happy with this. We've made a slight color correction here in Blender. We see the difference from on each side of the screen. To save this out, go back to render and click view render, so F11 or view render, and this will now be our composited image. So if we want to run renders again, we can do that by pressing F12 and then our outcome. So for example, we want to use the other camera, we want to composite that image, press F12, and when the render runs, it's going to run these processes across the entire image. So this is a useful way to just kind of edit every single render that is coming out of Blender, and then you can fine tune things in Photoshop. So when Blender has run all the render samples, right now it's on 900 of 1000. When it's run these samples, it's going to apply the compositing. So the compositing is now applied and the image color has shifted. So this is the result that we wanted. So again, I could go image, save as, and then save this as a new image. Okay, so that's just how we can do some color correction in Blender. There's a lot more things that we can do, but that's the start. Just a basic introduction. But I'm going to go into Photoshop now. So I've opened up my original to renders from Blender, and in Photoshop now I'm going to add some layers on top of this to adjust the color, and then we can add some additional effects on top. So very quickly, the way I do this is select this layer on the side, and then you have under this circular icon here, you've got all these different things that we can add. And the first one I will do is exposure. I can bring the exposure down a little bit and change this offset maybe a little bit to make it feel a little bit more like the output of a film camera, for example. Next, I'm going to add in a curves, and then similar to how we just did in Blender, just push up the top side of the curve towards the white direction and bring down the bottom side of the curve into the black direction. So this adds a bit more contrast in the image. Then I can control as well the red, green, and blue. So as we did before, the red, I'm just going to take a bit out of this, just a little bit to shift that more in a green-blue direction, and then just push in a little bit of blue into the image as well. So if you use these eyes, you can turn off and on the actions that we're taking, and this looks a lot nicer now with this blue and red adjustment. You could add in as well a color balance and kind of push as well these sliders into the directions that you want. So if you want to add a little bit more into that. If you think, okay, this looks nicer, it's a bit strong, and it's hard to adjust these tiny values here, choose your layer here that you've created, and then under opacity, just reduce this slightly. So you can turn this up and down the strength of this action just by using the opacity slider. We could add in a vibrance, we could add in a photo filter. The photo filters, you know, again, warming, yellow. We could add a cooling filter, quite strong. But take a look around. Maybe this warming one is kind of nice. And I just reduce this intensity a little bit. Okay. Then I think for now that's good. We could add a levels just on top of this to just take a bit more contrast in this image, maybe. Yeah, like that. Just slide in these black, grey, and white sliders around to see the effect of these levels. So when you've got all this together, you can stick this in a folder. So select all those layers that you've just created, press the folder icon, and rename this edit. So now if we want this edit to be applied to our other image, to this one, which is looking quite different in terms of color now, go to this image, choose this folder layer, drag and drop it onto our new image, and now we have the same color correction across both images, which is looking nice. The last thing I would do is just do a bit of motion blur on top of this. So I'm just going to duplicate this layer. I'm going to go to filter, noise, and add a noise. And I'm going to reduce the amount of this a little bit. And set it to uniform. Right. I'm going to duplicate this again, this one with noise, and I'm going to go to filter, blur, and then motion blur. And if I look at my motion blur settings, this spinner right here, spinning eye, as the direction of my blur. So if I want my camera to feel like it's moving this way, then I can set my blur this way. The distance is how blurry it is, so this is way too blurry, and this is just a little bit of shake, let's say. Let's press OK. So choose this top layer, press E to activate your eraser, set your hardness all the way down, and bring the size down to something reasonable. And then just delete, well, erase the main areas of this garment that you want to still be in focus. And if you leave some of the edges blurred, you can reduce this effect as well. So I'm just going to erase a bit of this and a bit of the ground around our character. I'm going to taper this down in the opacity a little bit, and then I'm going to taper this grain down as well. So I'll call this grain and this blur. And then if I reduce again a little bit the blur, a little bit the grain, we can start to set something up that feels like there's a little bit of camera shake and there's some film grain on this as well. So that is basically it for how I'm finishing my rendering, doing some color correction, adding little inconsistencies in the camera, whether it's blur or some depth of field or something. But in general, this is the way that I am processing my images after I have finished setting my scene in Blender and after I've done all my rendering. So I hope this was useful for you guys. If it was, please like and subscribe, and then come back next time for the next series, which is going to be about leather texturing.